Replacing your motorcycle's engine coolant. Something you can do at home with a few basic tools, and it's pretty straightforward. With a little bit of knowledge, you can take this on easily. This here is a second gen SV650, and the manual calls for doing this every 2 years. Sometimes I do it a little more frequently because this is a track bike at this point. If you have the SV650S, you are going to have to remove the upper cowl. Unfortunately, Suzuki didn't put any kind of access panel in there so you get to the filler. So obviously that's removed in this case, and you're also going to need to remove the seat and tip the tank up so you have access to the overflow reservoir, which is on the left side of the bike. So the tools that we're going to need to do that, we're going to need our 6mm Allen. That'll get you the seat off. You're going to need to remove a couple bolts from the front of the tank there. In this case, I have a steering stabilizer that uses those holes, so it might be a little bit different for me. But what also is in common is you'll need your prop rod for the tank, so you can get to that cap inside there. Another tool you'll need, the humble 10mm wrench, a bucket for everything to drain into, and a funnel filling up your both your overflow reservoir and the radiator itself. Now, if you have the naked bike, this is all very accessible and easy to do. You just have the cap down here. So when you're starting off, make sure that your bike is cold. That may seem obvious to some of you, but you don't want to be working on a hot bike because then your system is going to be pressurized and it could come out pretty forcefully and cause some burns. So let's get to it. So what we're going to do here is identify the water pump area, and there is one 10mm bolt and only one on that piece. The rest of them are smaller bolts. So we are going to remove this. There will be some dripping happening as soon as that is removed. So I have a towel down underneath it. If you have a pan, that's also a good idea. So let's get to it. So we can go ahead and remove this. There will be some fluid coming out. It won't be a ton because it is still got a bit of a vacuum to it, right? With the cap still on. All right, we'll set this aside. I like to put it with my wrench. I like to keep my bolts in where they belong as well, so I don't lose them. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is remove our radiator cap. Once that happens, it'll allow the fluid to come out. See it trickle out a little bit. There we go. And then pour out. As soon as this is done draining, we can throw the bolt back inside and move on to the next phase. Oh, it's dripping. Certainly good enough for me. Put that in there. Now you could, walk away for an hour or so. Make sure you get every last bit of it, but I think this is more than sufficient. So I'm putting that bolt back in there and tightening it down at this point. Draining goes pretty quickly, right? All right, now before I start filling it up, I do want to cover something that's pretty important, and that is adding water, coolant, antifreeze to it. If you live in a place where it does freeze, certainly antifreeze is a good idea. You don't want your block cracking or anything like that. I don't. I live in a warmer climate, and the bike is always in the garage unless it's going to or from or at the track. So what I'm choosing instead is a product with water wetter in it, and what that does is achieves all the coolant properties that we need, but without any of the antifreeze in it. And the antifreeze is what gets really slippery. So it's a good idea not to have that on the track if you can avoid it, because if you lay it down, somebody else is going to be laying their bike down right behind you, guaranteed, especially if you're on the racing line. So you could use, speaking of the water specifically, deionized water, you may have heard, is ideal, and that is true. You might think that something like purified water is also just as acceptable, but actually it's not. If you're using something like that, chances are all the minerals, especially if it's gone through an evaporation process, all the minerals are gone from it entirely. So what's going to happen is it gets in there, it gets in contact with metal components, and it tries to get those minerals back. So what it's going to do is actually pull some of those minerals and be a bit corrosive, believe it or not, to your engine. So deionized water, great. Distilled water, do not. Frankly, that's something that I've used before. And in the process of doing research for projects like this, to make videos for you, I do all the research, I dig into it, and I have learned that's not the way to go. So let's avoid the distilled water. So I'm not sponsored by Redline, but I do like their products. I've been using them for quite a while. And so I'm going to use a pre-mixed Super Cool here. And we'll put that in the radiator. We'll need to move the bar out of the way a little bit there. I like to put 2 holes in the foil. That way a little air gets in, it doesn't glug. Just take our time to pour it in slowly. You're going to want to pour it in until it gets all the way to the top. And you'll actually be able to hear it kind of gurgling and burping up. So there's a lot of air that we're displacing here. You can actually kind of squeeze the hose and distribute the water a little bit better. You get a little bit of air out that way. But we'll just keep on going. It's not necessary to really pump it through like that, because we'll fire it up and then the engine will do the work. All right, now the coolant is pretty much towards the top of the radiator. At this point, we can fire the bike up and we can let the water circulate, let some of the air come out, and get it done. also gotten up to operating temperature, meaning it's gotten hot enough for the thermostat to open. Then we know it's really cycled through the whole engine. In this case, the thermostat should open around 180 degrees. I'd like to take it to about 190 just to make sure that's the case. And I can see more coolant is required. We purge the air out of the system. And just a tiny bit. Basically enough to fill up the hose here on the top of the radiator. So once that's complete, just do remember that you are working with a hot engine at this point, but not that we really need to touch anything that's particularly hot. Just be aware. So as I mentioned earlier, the overflow tank is on the left side of the bike. It's tucked away here. You can see that our fluid was pink, which helps us find out where that level is. If it's particularly clear, then it becomes a little more difficult. But we ended up just under the full line. I'm gonna call that good. If you do want to top it off, or if you need to do that, there is a plug here on the top. It simply lifts off. And there you go. Stick your funnel in there, add more coolant. Be sure to plug it back up. And you're good to go. You have just completed your coolant change.